Hi, Emily here. Welcome back to the Beaming Quilt class. We are now on week 2 where I'm going to show you exactly how to cut your fabrics to make your beaming quilt. So let's go ahead and recap. Last week we learned how to pick out our fabrics. So by now you should have your background fabric, your binding fabric, as well as your fat quarters for the star colors. I'm making the throw size, so I have 10 fat quarters. But if you're making the baby size, you'll have 5 fat quarters, and if you're making the bed size, you'll have 22 fat quarters. You should also have your copy of the Beaming Quilt pattern, either as the paper booklet, just like I have, or you might have a PDF version on your device, or you might have even printed out the PDF version. Whichever version works for you is fine with me. But before we start cutting out our fabric, I really want to make sure that we read through the entire pattern so that we know where we're going from here. Let's go ahead and start off with just going through the pattern together. So you'll see on the back of the cover, or if you're using the PDF version, it'll just be on the first page. You'll have the fabric requirements. We've already gone over how to read those and what those look like for the Beaming Quilt. Next up, you'll also see the cutting instructions, and we're going to dive into that in depth today. Then you'll also, the next page, you'll see the flying geese units. So read through. We're using the 4 at a time flying geese method, and I'll definitely cover that next week during the class. I'll show you step by step how to do it. But if you want to get a good feel, if you've never done that method before, I do have a tutorial. There's a link to it in the pattern for you. That's the 4 at a time flying geese method. So check that out. Look at the diagrams, read the instructions, get yourself familiar with it. The next stage of making our quilt, the following week of the class, will be making the scrappy hourglass units. So look through those instructions as well. And as I had for the flying geese, I also have a tutorial for specifically scrappy hourglass units in general. That's not specific for the beaming pattern, but it'll walk you through the process and get you more familiar with it. And then the following week, and the next page of the pattern, is how to piece the quilt blocks together. And then from there you'll see how we start adding our sashing and borders. So go ahead and read through the whole pattern to get yourself familiar with it. Beyond that, there's also some additional instructions for the AccuQuilt version. So if you are using AccuQuilt, go ahead and flip to the AccuQuilt section of your pattern and read through that, and notice how the cutting instructions differ between using AccuQuilt and traditional cutting. And I'll be showing both methods here today for you. So I'll start off with traditional cutting, but I'll also show the AccuQuilt method as well. So use the little chapters in the bottom here if you need to fast forward to a specific section of this video. So once we've read through the entire pattern, we're ready to get started. Before I even start cutting, I like to prep my fabrics. So I will fill up a spray bottle. This is what I use, totally optional. You do not have to do this, but I fill up a spray bottle with Best Press, and that's just my personal preference for spray starch. But many people don't use spray starch at all, or they'll use steam in their iron. But basically what I'll be using is using Best Press and a nice hot iron. So now I'm going to go ahead and turn my iron on and get it all set up. So once you've got your nice hot iron, your fabric, your optional spray starch, you are ready to start prepping your fabric. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the background fabric because that is the way that the pattern is written. But go ahead and lay your background fabric out. I take it the way that it came off the bolt, so it's still folded. We have our fold here. And then I'll go ahead and start spraying it with my starch, paying extra attention to where there are creases from where it might have come out from being folded. So I just give it a nice little mist. It doesn't have to be soaked or anything. Some people do soak their fabric. I personally do not. And then I go ahead and shift the fabric so that the selvages match up. Sometimes the fabric comes off the bolt matching up pretty well, but sometimes it does not. So I'm going to line up the selvages to match, And then also try to get it nice and straight. You can kind of look for the grain of the fabric so that we have a fairly straight edge here. And then we'll go ahead and press. So now as you're pressing, I like to move my iron slowly across the fabric, making sure that it can even out any creases, and then it'll also dry the best press or starch as it heats up. And once you've done one little section, you can go ahead and move your fabric along and then do the next section. So doing it on the background fabric will definitely be the most time consuming because it is rather large. So I like to put on some music or a show and just take my time with it. Now, once you get to the end of your background fabric, because it is folded, you might want to flip it over and starch the opposite side as well. But if you feel like the opposite side is nice and flat, then you don't necessarily need to do that part. So once we get the background all prepped and ready to go, we can go ahead and move on to our fat quarters and do the same process. So you'll see here, I can just go ahead and unfold them. This will be an 18-inch by 21-inch piece of fabric. I'll lay it out nice and flat on the ironing board and then spray. I do give it just a little bit extra spray right where the creases are. If your fabric has been folded for a very long time, those creases will be really strong. So you might need to give it a little bit more attention, either with the iron or with steam or with your starch, to get it to go nice and flat. And now when I'm working with fat quarters, I actually like to layer them on top of each other on the ironing board like this, just because then the ones underneath it get a little extra pressing, and then they're already lined up for cutting if you choose to cut multiple layers at the same time. Once all of your fat quarters are pressed nice and crisp and flat, we will go ahead and start cutting. You do have the option now to prep your binding fabric as well, but I normally save the binding for the very end of the quilt. So I'm just going to prep the background fabric and the star fat quarters, and then we'll go ahead and start cutting out our pieces. So now all my fabric is prepped and ready to go. So we're going to start cutting. Before we start cutting, we're going to go ahead and just read through the instructions. I'm making the throw size, and we're going to start with background fabric. Background fabric typically is like the most cutting needed, and it can sometimes be a little bit more complex. So I'll walk you through each step here. So the first one, we have to cut 4 7.5-inch width of fabric strips, WOF. That's typically 42 inches, which is what we're using for quilting cotton. So 7.5 inches for each strip, and we can do that in a couple different ways. I personally use this 6-inch by 24-inch ruler quite a bit, but that's not quite big enough. So another way that we can do 7.5-inch strips is to use the guide marks on our mat itself. So you can look at your mat and find the 7.5 inch line and the 0 line and use that as a guide. Or if you have a bigger ruler, like this 12.5 inch square one will work. Or even if you have like I also have an 8.5 inch by 24 inch ruler, but that's not necessarily needed. So I want to show you a couple other ways as well, so you don't have to go out and buy another ruler. So first things first, we'll go ahead and grab our background fabric. So I've got a piece of mine here. I'm actually using the end of bolts from the quilt kits that I put together. So I've got a few smaller pieces, but yours can definitely be all 3 yards. Just let the rest of it drape off the side of your table, or kind of fold it up at the edge of your mat. So anyway, you'll also see I have 2 different color mats. I have the navy blue one that I prefer using most of the time. But because I'm cutting out navy blue fabric, it's going to be a lot easier to see what I'm doing on the brighter color mat. But this one happens to be pink, which is the other color in the kits. So I'll switch to the blue mat when I'm cutting the pink fabric. Some mats have like a lighter color on one side and a darker color on the other side. So that's a really great option if you have one of those. But if not, you can still do it on any color mat. I just wanted to make sure that it was visible to you through the camera. So that's why you'll see I have a different mat than usual today. So anyway, we'll get started on these 7.5 inch strips. But before we actually start cutting the strips, we want to make a nice clean edge. So you'll see here, this edge is straight off the bolt. I'll move it over so you can see. This edge is straight off the bolt. It's very messy. It's not exactly even by any means. So I'm going to go ahead and bring my ruler up real close to the edge. Make sure it's straight across the top fold and then also straight across the bottom. And that's how you can make sure that you're fairly straight on grain. And then go ahead and use one hand to press down. I'm right-handed, so I'm using my left hand to press down on the ruler, and then my right hand to gently press the rotary blade into the mat and go all the way down the line. So you'll see, close the blade as soon as you're done using it. I have this little bit of trash to throw away, but I also have a very nice crisp straight edge, and we're going to start cutting from that straight line. So I've got my little trash can here on the side. I'm going to keep that there so that I can easily throw away any trash. So now we have our straight edge, and because I'm right-handed, I've got to flip this piece of fabric around. One of the reasons I love having my cutting mat in the center of the room is that I can then also walk around to the other side. But the way I have my camera set up, I'm going to flip the fabric. But if you have an option to cut from multiple sides, it helps moving your fabric a little bit less. So here's one way to do it where we're going to use our cutting mat for the exact dimensions of our strips. So we're cutting 7.5 inch strips. We're going to line that nice straight flat edge up with the 0 line. And then we're going to use the lines on our cutting mat, 7.5 right here. And then because this mat's a little smaller, I have to fold it up and find 7.5 inch there. Line it up, and then we can go ahead and cut on that line. This is not the most precise way to cut, but it will work for some of these larger pieces. So we'll cut 7.5 inches right there. Move this piece away, and then you can kind of check your work and see how did we do. And you'll see that's a 7.5 inch by width of fabric strip. And we have to cut 4 of those. So I cut 1 already using that method. Now let me show you a different method of cutting. Instead of using the nice long ruler, we're going to now use our square ruler. We'll go ahead and don't pay attention to the lines on your mat and only pay attention to the lines on the ruler. I line the 7.5 inch line up with the edge of my fabric and then make sure that it's even across the fold. And then we'll go ahead and press and cut about halfway, and then we'll shift our ruler and make sure that we get 7.5 inches there. Kind of check to see where you last cut and then cut the rest of the way. So now you'll see that's 2 different ways to cut out your 7.5-inch strips. So now I'm going to layer both of these strips on top of each other because our goal here is to cut out squares. So when you look at the pattern, you'll see you're cutting out 4 7.5-inch strips, and then from those strips we're going to cut out 20 7.5-inch squares. Let's also take a moment here to walk through the pattern itself. We also kind of want to know why we're cutting the squares. So where do these squares end up in the pattern? And you'll see they're actually on the next page. Use one 7.5-inch background square for the flying geese. So we know that that is used in the flying geese. So that kind of helps us as we start cutting to know exactly what we're cutting it for. So now that I know what I'm cutting it for, I'm going to go ahead and cut off these selvages here. I've got 4 layers lined up of the fabric to create fewer cuts. And I'm going to line this straight line all the way across the top of the fabric and then check along the bottom as well. And then hold it down and cut the selvage off. Now we can go ahead and throw these little bits away. I'll move the ruler. We've got 4 clean edges here. Move the fabric, and this is where we're cutting our 7.5-inch squares. So you'll see right here, I've got 7.5 going this way, and then also 7.5 going down. Hold it and cut. And each strip should get us 5 squares. We started cutting at the selvages because when we get this direction, we'll see this is a fold. We might need to unfold the strips. And you'll see that this does not give us a full 7.5 inches, but we weren't expecting it to. We'll go ahead and unfold both of these and press it with a hot iron real quick. Giving it a nice little press just kind of takes away some of the sharp crease from that fold. So now we'll go ahead and line these up 7.5 inches and cut off the excess. Now we have these little scraps. We can save these for later. So I'll just make a separate pile of our scraps. And we have our 7.5-inch squares cut for our flying geese. Now, if you're making your flying geese using AccuQuilt, you will not cut out these 7.5-inch squares from your background fabric. And I'll show you how we cut out AccuQuilt flying geese in a minute. The next step you'll see for cutting out our background fabric is to cut out some 3.5-inch strips. So another thing we want to look for is where do we use those 3.5-inch squares. So you'll see those 3.5-inch background squares stay squares throughout the pattern. So we're going to be cutting those either with AccuQuilt or with our regular rotary cutter, and those will stay 3.5-inch squares. So I'm going to show you 2 different methods here for cutting out your 3.5-inch squares. First off, I'm going to cut like I had been cutting earlier, using a nice long ruler and my rotary cutter. This ruler is where I'm looking for the numbers. So we're going to go 1, 2, 3.5 inches, and we'll line that up all the way from the bottom here to the top here and press it down with some strength here so that the ruler doesn't slide as we're cutting. And there we go. We have a 3.5-inch strip, which then can be cut down into squares. I also want to show you another tool that I recommended in last week's video. Another neat tool that you might have that you want to use would be a Stripology XL ruler. And this is a massive ruler with all of these little slits in it every 1/2 inch. This is the XL version. They have just a normal, they have different sizes, but I recommend this size. And to prep our fabric for that, go ahead and take your fold and fold it up towards your selvage. So now we actually have 4 layers of fabric here. And we'll go ahead and kind of give it a nice little press to give it a crease. Put your Stripology ruler on top, and we're gonna line it up so that the 0 line comes just on the inside of the fabric on all 4 layers, hopefully. And then we're gonna line up one of these lines down here with the fabric itself. One thing I love about the Stripology ruler is it has white and black lines on the ruler itself. So we can use one of the white lines to line up with this fold, and that'll be really easy to see against the dark blue fabric. And we're gonna cut 3.5 inch strips. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut one line on the 0. And then we're gonna go ahead and cut at the 3.5. And then the 7. And then 3.5 more. So 1, 2, 3.5. So the 10.5. And I'm gonna have to repeat this with more fabric. But you'll see here, we've got some scraps, but then we also have all 3 of our strips nicely cut. We didn't have to move our ruler at all, which is nice. And now I'm going to show you another trick. So we can use the Stripology ruler to actually cut out our squares, or you can cut them out like we did for the other squares. But you'll see here, I've got my strips and I'm going to lay them out this way. I'm going to layer some on top of each other. I'll layer this one as well. So now we've got some of our strips for the example purposes. I'll go ahead and lay this right on top, making sure that we have the selvages here. We're going to cut those off, so that'll be at the 0 line. And then we'll just line up all the rows. Perfect. So now we're cutting 3.5 inch squares. So I'm going to cut at the 0, at the 3.5, at the 7, at the 10.5, at the 14, at the 17.5, and then also this is the 21 basically. I have a little bit there. Your fabric might not be as big as mine. When you use a solid, sometimes they're a little bit wider, but we ended up with a little bit on each one. I'm just gonna put that in my little tiny scraps bin, save these for later in case I do any tiny piecing later on. But I'll go ahead and throw away the selvages here, and we'll take away our Stripology ruler and check our work. So next you'll see we have all of our squares nicely cut out, and we can stack them up nice and neat. And that is why I love using the Stripology, because it's just so much faster than moving the ruler every time. Now, if you're cutting your squares without the Stripology ruler, you'll just go ahead and lay your strips. I actually have 3 strips on top of each other here so that I can cut a lot at one time. But you might want to just start off with 1 strip as you're learning. But then you can go ahead and cut out your selvage. And then just move your ruler every 3.5 inches. We'll cut our little squares out just like this. So now back to the pattern, we'll go ahead and look at the next thing that we're cutting out is 17 2.5 inch by width of fabric strips. So that is actually used for the sashing. So when we look at the pattern, you'll see the background is in between each block, and then we have some long sashing strips along the sides and the borders. So that's what those 2.5 inch strips are for. So now you can cut out your 2.5 inch strips either using an AccuQuilt machine or a Stripology ruler or a normal rotary cutter and ruler like I showed you earlier. If you're going to use a ruler, you would keep your fabric nice and wide and use a nice long ruler, or you can fold it in half like this and use a Stripology Ruler, which I'll show you again from this other angle. Something I love about Stripology is that it actually has markings to show you the 2.5 inch lines. So we are cutting out a lot of 2.5 inch strips here, and we're going to line up kind of the raw edge, but like make sure that we get a nice clean cut at 0. And then on the Stripology Ruler, every 2.5 inches, there's this little square icon. So every 2.5 inches is a square, every 1.5 inches is a star. So I line up the edges nice and straight, and then I can just go ahead and look for that square icon as I go across. Once you've finished cutting out all of your background pieces, you're ready to move on to cutting out the fat quarters. So I do want to show you here, in order to save time, I'm actually layering multiple fat quarters on top of each other. So I have 3 fat quarters here to cut all at one time. And then I'll just grab my ruler and my rotary cutter so I can get started. You'll see from each fat quarter, we're going to cut 2 7.5 inch squares and 8 4-inch squares. The 7.5 inch squares that we're cutting are going to be used for that center piece of each block, this little unit for our scrappy hourglass unit, and then the 4 squares from each fat quarter will be matched up with the background 7.5 inch square to make our flying geese. So we'll go ahead and get started with this now. The first step I'm going to do is cut off the selvage. So I've got all 3 of my fabric selvages lined up on top of each other, and I can just snip them all off at one time. Next, I'm going to go ahead and rotate the fabric so that I have that nice clean edge to be working with. And I can go ahead and start cutting out my 4-inch squares. So I'll line up the edge of the ruler with the 4-inch line and cut that straight. And we're cutting 8 squares out of each fat quarter. So I'm gonna need 2 little strips of 4 inches. And then we can cut our 2 7.5 inch squares. And I'm gonna use the other ruler for this so that it's easier to cut 7.5 inches. Line it up, start cutting. And then I'll go ahead and move the ruler. And then you might be left over with some extra fabric that we can use in a scrappier project later on. So next you'll see we've got our 4 inches on both of these. I'll just layer those on top of each other. We're gonna cut those into squares and then these into squares. I've got these ones handy, so I'll start with my 7.5 inches. I'll start by lining up a straight line across, trimming the excess so that we have a nice square edge, and then we will rotate. So the same process that we've been doing. Get that nice clean edge. So now we just have one more edge to cut. Line it up and trim it off. So there's one 7.5 inch square, and here's the second. So I've got both of those, and I actually cut 3 layers at a time. So 3 of my fat quarters already have their 7.5 inch square, and then I can start cutting these. This might be a lot at one time. Trim off the extra. Yeah, it's starting to shift a tiny bit under my ruler, so I just have to press down really hard as I cut. So now line it up with the 4-inch line, and we'll start cutting some squares. Perfect, and then we have a little bit extra there as well. So now we've got 8 4-inch squares and 2 7.5-inch squares from all 3 of those fat quarters. I'll repeat for the others. And next, I'm going to also show you how to use AccuQuilt instead to cut out your pieces. Now, if you've been dying to use an AccuQuilt fabric cutting machine to make your beaming quilt, this is the part of the video for you. So I'm going to start off by demonstrating using one of the fat quarters, but you'll see in the pattern that I have all of the diagrams spelled out for the 3 dies that you'll need to make each star block. So first off, the 3.5-inch square die. Next is the 6.5-inch quarter square triangle die, and then a 3.5-inch half square triangle die. All 3 of these dies are in the 12-inch mix and match cube, and I'll put a link to this in the description below for you. It's one of my favorite die sets from AccuQuilt, and it makes making a lot of quilts very easy. We'll go ahead and get started. I showed you already how to cut using regular cutting for the 7.5-inch squares and for the 4-inch squares. But those pieces that are used for the flying geese and regular cutting are different for using AccuQuilt. So instead of cutting 7.5-inch squares out of our background fabric, we're actually going to cut the exact triangles that we need. They're quarter square triangles. So you'll see in the pattern it has you cut with the fabric strips with our background fabric, and that is slightly bigger than the die so that you have a little bit of overage on each end. If you've never used an AccuQuilt fabric cutting machine before, I have a few other resources that I would love for you to watch before you start cutting with your machine. I have a video linked down below, and I think I can link it right here for you as well, how to use an AccuQuilt Go machine. It'll walk you through all of the basics. So we'll go ahead and get started using the fat quarter because that's the one that has a little bit more intricacies with the layout. The pattern does include a diagram showing you how to cut it out, but I wanted to walk you through it as well. So one option that you have is to, prior to cutting out with AccuQuilt, cut your fabric using a rotary cutter to squares that are just bigger than the die. However, that's like twice as much cutting that we need to do. So I'm going to show you using a whole fat quarter how to cut out the star colors on the diagram. So we'll start off with our fat quarter, and I'm going to go ahead and fold it in half, and we're going to keep our selvage edge close to each other. We're going to use our selvage edge on the die. So I'll show you right here. We've got our die. I'm going to lay out the selvage edge here and then cover up that die. And then I'm going to use my finger to finger press and see where that die blade hits. We want it to be fully covered by 2 layers of fabric because we have the fat quarter here. And I actually like to bring the fabric all the way to the fold, bring that fold close to the edge of the die. So now I'm going to put the mat on top and just run it straight through the machine. So now you'll notice this was just with 2 layers. You can cut up to 6 layers of cotton with your AccuQuilt. I then press down and slide off, and you'll see we have all of our shapes nicely cut out. I did have a couple snags here. I'll just go ahead and grab those with my scissors, 2 little areas. And now we have our quarter square triangles all ready to go. These will be turned into our scrappy hourglass blocks. So now we have the rest of this fabric. I'm going to go ahead and trim. I use my scissors to trim off the excess here. It just keeps it cleaner as we feed it through the machine. We're done with this die. We're going to transition over to our half square triangles. So now we'll go ahead and take our fat quarter that we just ran through the machine and fold it one more time. So now we have 4 layers at a time, and we're going to lay that on top of our die. And then put a mat on top. Actually, you should be using a smaller mat. AccuQuilt recommends using the mat that's sized for the die. This one's kind of been used a lot, so we'll see how it goes. but I'll run it through. And yeah, that mat is a little old. But you'll see, we now have 8 little triangles for the half square triangles. And now we just run that through one more time. We have plenty of fabric here. Just keep it there. Put the mat on top, and then I'm gonna trim off this excess. It's just in the way. So we keep it a little plainer and then feed it through. So now whether you choose to cut out using AccuQuilt or your rotary cutter, you should be able to cut out all of your back quarters and your background fabric so that we're ready to start piecing next week. We'll be piecing starting with the flying geese. So if you want to work ahead a little bit, feel free to check out the flying geese tutorial on my website, and I'll also link that below for you. If you have any questions or if there's something that I maybe didn't touch on but you're itching to know, feel free to drop a comment below and I'd be happy to help you out. Good luck and happy sewing. See you next week.